Hi everyone, in this video I want to discuss three things that help explain and overcome why it is that the Ron Paul revolution is seen by the mainstream media and the average Americans as being fringe and just a little loony, right? The first thing I want to discuss is Ron Paul's economic message, right? Ron Paul, for example, he wants to go back to the gold standard and eventually abolish the Federal Reserve, our central bank. Now, when the mainstream media and the average American hears this, I think common sense has them believing that this man has to be crazy, right? How can our economics establishment, right, the Federal Reserve, with all our universities and some of our brightest students, be so wrong? And this man preaching something that just seems so antiquated be right? Right? So it makes perfect sense to me that the average American and the mainstream media reaches this conclusion and they inevitably think that Ron Paul and his movement is just a little fringe, right? So I'm not going to go into the details as to how our mainstream economics establishment can actually be wrong and when Ron Paul preaches be right. But at the very least, we can go over one example that is very important, right? Socialism and communism is spread through the minds of many intellectuals that had good intentions and really believed in it, right? And it spread through Russia, through Europe, through China, and it brought about devastation. So, and obviously all human beings are the same. We are no different really biologically than the Chinese and the Russians, and it could happen over here as well. So our mainstream economic establishment is obviously not as wrong as the economic establishment that brought about communism in Europe, but it's still not as right as it could be, right? So again, without going into too much detail as how our entire economic establishment can be wrong, at the very least, we can always point to that great example, right? Why it is that all of these people in Europe fell for socialism with good intentions and a lot of smart people, okay? So the second and third things I want to discuss is they relate to why it is that we look so fringe, right? And the first one is, well, the Ron Paul revolution is constantly bashing government, saying that government is evil, that politicians are evil, that the corporations are evil, and all this stuff. We make it seem like there's somebody pulling the strings and all that stuff. So again, that just makes us look crazy because it's not true, right? Government is not evil. Most politicians, one can say that they're ignorant of economics, but at the same time, they get advice from the Federal Reserve. If our mainstream economics establishment suddenly told Congress all the time, wait a minute, guys, we cannot do this. We got to get rid of the Federal Reserve. We got to go back to the gold standard. If all of our universities and the Federal Reserve preach these things, then obviously I think the politicians would say, oh, okay, fine, we'll do it. But the politicians go around bringing all their crazy ideas and bringing us further into debt and doing all these things because our mainstream economic establishment just doesn't tell them that it's wrong. So one cannot blame the politicians for all this stuff. And again, our federal government and government of various levels is made up of average Americans who show up to work every day with good intentions. And again, this whole idea that government is evil, it just makes us look crazy. The third thing is with the message itself, right? The message of freedom, the message of respect for the Constitution. Again, freedom, most people and the mainstream media think that freedom leads to chaos, right? If we just let everyone be free, right, to do whatever they want, as long as they don't harm anyone else, I think most people just see it as a recipe for chaos. Most people look at the social order today and it's so complex. If we just let people do whatever they want, aren't we just going to have like chaos? Aren't only the wealthy going to be able to afford education? What are the poor going to do if we do not have public education, right? Isn't the white man going to oppress all the minorities? Aren't the corporations just going to only pay very little for labor? Can't somebody just sell any false remedy and say that he's a doctor and cause all kinds of harm if we don't have the FDA and all these things? Won't people be high, in the streets, if we don't ban drugs and all this stuff? So again, it makes sense that the average person thinks that freedom just leads to chaos. And again, the Constitution, most people say, oh, the Constitution was simple, but it was great for a simpler past. In the 1700s, the population was a lot smaller, the social order was a lot simpler. So again, that's why the Constitution and individual freedom just seems like an antiquated concept, right? But the truth is that the mainstream media and the average person has it wrong. Individual freedom, as opposed to leading to social chaos, leads to social prosperity. It leads to high-paying salaries. It leads to low prices. It leads to efficiency in healthcare, in computers, in everything. But again, without an understanding of economics, we very easily make the mistake of thinking that freedom leads to social chaos as opposed to social order. So the bottom line is that we should not go out there and bash government and all this stuff. The real culprit, the real problem here is economic ignorance, right? And since we are fighting a battle of ignorance, not a battle of good versus evil, we should not go out there insulting the politicians. We should really just... I'm reminded, I went to see Ron Paul in Kansas City, and one of the last questions that this woman asked Ron Paul was, okay, Dr. Paul, so what can we do to help, right? And Dr. Paul told the lady, you should try to educate yourself. You need to understand how freedom works, right? And we understand how freedom works. As opposed to fearing freedom, we understand how freedom works by understanding economics, right? And just very briefly, right? Freedom is the key ingredient of competition, right? Competition is what spreads an efficient orders through society, right? When people have freedom, they get to give their money to the companies that have the good ideas, right? When a company has a good idea, it gets your money. So that good idea then spreads through all the competitors, right? If a competitor doesn't build cars in an efficient way, it goes out of business. So competition and freedom is what creates all the incentives that push the right knowledge through every brain in society. So if you don't have freedom and all the money goes to the government, then you have a monopoly. The government doesn't have competition. It doesn't have to learn from various alternatives. The government just gives us one solution, and whether it's good or bad, it's a very slow process of changing. So freedom is the key ingredient on competition, and competition is the key ingredient of spreading knowledge and superior ways of doing things through society.